So I want to suggest something very contradictory, and don't forget, each one is all about being contradictory. Contradictory thinking, not just for the sake of being contrary, but as a tool, as a mechanism, a conceptual method that allows us to shift from that lower road that Wang Xiangzhai talks about to that higher road level of thinking about things. And the thing I want to suggest is that right now, in this day and age, Chinese martial arts are the highest level that they've ever been. And I know this contradicts the general sentiment. If you go onto a Chinese martial arts forum, discussion forum on the internet, you'll inevitably see an argument about this subject. And the general thrust of the argument will be that, well, even if there are one or two people here and there who've still got the real thing, nevertheless, everything else has degenerated to the point where it's virtually lost and is on the verge of becoming obsolete. Now, we can unpack that a little bit later as to why people think that and what the solution is to that. But for now, we should recognise that it's a certain way of thinking that looks at the mass of people who are practicing Chinese martial arts. It looks at an overall number of people and the average level and says, well, the average level is quite low. And particularly under the pressure of a wider global martial arts system where we have things like mixed martial arts and we have other fighting arts, fighting systems that have reached a very high level. And let's be honest, Chinese Wushu is not competing on that basis, and that explains why so many teachers or Chinese martial arts enthusiasts have really given up the game. They've given up and they've started to talk about cultural enrichment, health and well-being, spiritual enlightenment, anything but practical relevance in a world of ever-increasing fight competence. And I think for a while people had a hope in Yiquan that it would be that thing that they could point to if their friend did Muay Thai and said that Chinese martial arts were rubbish and don't work. Then you could point to Yiquan and say, well, look at this. This is the practical expression of Chinese martial arts. In fact, I saw only recently on a discussion forum that someone had asked about practical Chinese martial arts and where they could find that. And someone had responded by saying, well, you should go and look at Yiquan. Yiquan's the no-nonsense, fight-based version of Chinese Wushu. And I had to have a little bit of a laugh to myself because anyone who went on the internet and looked up Yiquan, for the most part, would not come away with that conclusion. In fact, I'm embarrassed to say that I practice Yiquan in case anyone does go and look it up on the internet. If anything, the nonsense and the BS is significantly more advanced in Yiquan than it is in any other Chinese martial art, and that's just because the people within the Yiquan discussion space, which for me means an area, for example, online where people are talking about Yiquan. It doesn't mean that that's an Yiquan community. It doesn't mean that those people actually seriously practice Yiquan. It just means that they like to talk about it. They like to wear it as a kind of personality jewellery. And part of that process is talking a ridiculously big game, writing checks that the people writing them could never cash in reality, talking about things like ultimate levels of martial arts achievement or true martial arts achievement. And you look at the reality of the people who are saying things like that and all you can do is shake your head. No wonder people think in that case that Chinese Wushu really is lost. But the reality is it's always been like that, and to understand this you need a different way of thinking. It's not about numbers, or at least this analysis of what counts as, is there high level in this era? That's not about numbers, it's not about average level. So let's imagine that, say, Wang Xiangzhai was the highest level master of Wushu that had ever existed up until that point. I don't I don't necessarily believe that that's true, but let's just imagine that for the sake of a thought experiment. And let's imagine that there was no one else ever of his level, and there was no one in his generation of his level. And let's imagine also that everyone else in his generation was absolute garbage. And I don't believe that either, but let's just imagine that. That being the situation, it would still be the case that Chinese Wushu was at that time the highest level that it had ever been. And this has always been the case throughout the history of Wushu. There's a tiny number of people who achieve the real thing, and there's a vast majority of people who, well, let's look at it from Wang Xiangzhai's perspective. So this that I'm describing is the ratio problem, and it's the thing that Wang Xiangzhai set out to solve. He didn't get this initially. It took time for him to understand and conceptualize this. And he tells us this right from the start, or rather, when we learn about Yiquan, it's one of the very first things that we hear, that Wang Xiangzhai travelled across China and he met over 1,000 people, and he could then count on one hand the number of people who truly achieved it. And we should stop for a moment and think about what that means to say that they achieved it. First of all, it doesn't mean that they learned it. So it's entirely possible that of those people who had achieved it, their own teachers hadn't. And that's, again, very contradictory to the way that people have been groomed into thinking about Chinese Wushu. And let's be clear, they've been groomed into thinking that way by people whose own level hasn't reached that point of achievement, and they want to mask this. And I'm not saying that just to be vicious. It's critical to understand this because it's essential to Wang Xiangzhai's understanding of what Yiquan is as a social project. Once you understand Wang Xiangzhai's way of thinking, then you see that it's entirely possible for there to be generations of people who don't get it. Direct lines in so-called lineages of people who just haven't achieved it, and then someone does. And the question Wang Xiangzhai asks is, why? And then, well, how do we change this round? So it's not about being vicious. It's not about criticizing people in a vicious way. It's not about unnecessarily attacking people's levels. You have to understand this as a conceptual argument. There's something that happens that allows what Wang Xiangzhai sees as the true understanding of Wushu to emerge within people. And it really is a process of emergence. Somehow, through some sort of practice, some people have this thing that emerges from within them. Not from learning forms, not from any kind of fixed thing that the teacher passes down to them, like they're inheriting property and then they suddenly have it. I'll talk about this process of emergence another time, and I'll give some really good examples from Yao Zongzun's students of where you can see the thing itself beginning to emerge. But there's something else that I said we needed to understand about this idea of achieving rather than learning. And this is the idea that what you achieve when you achieve higher level is different in different generations. So it's not a fixed thing. It's not a fixed level that someone has and is the same throughout time. Therefore, someone who's achieved it 1,000 years ago could come back today and win the UFC. I know that people hold on to that fantasy, but if you can't disappoint that expectation, and I think we all had it at one point, but I can assure you, the real truth is so much more interesting, it's so much more profound. The way is not far from the people. The simplicity of the true idea is infinitely more profound. So we come back to the idea of dependence arising, this key Buddhist concept that begins with the idea that nothing has any kind of fixed value. Again, this is an idea that is now proven by quantum physics, which is absolutely fascinating. Nothing has a fixed value, nothing. And that means that even high level has no fixed value. It's entirely dependent and contingent upon its mutual relationship with everything else. So in martial arts terms, what counts as high level changes from generation to generation based on the level of, well, I've used the word Dharma before because I'm drawing on Wang Xiangzhai's use of Buddhist concepts, but we needn't hold on to that. We can see it in perfectly scientific or sociological terms that there are quintessence principles of Wushu, and these are timeless and unchanging. And then there's fightcraft, which is constantly changing and evolving. And that's a mutually dependent system. It's dependent arising upon the global martial arts community. And we can come back to that, but for now we can say that when we say achieve high level in Chinese Wushu, that doesn't mean that that highest level is equivalent to the highest level in other martial arts. It only means that relative to the vast majority of people who are practicing Chinese Wushu, you are on an entirely different higher level. And as I've said before, you have to be very careful here because it's like a trick that we play on our minds when we say that Wang Xiangzhai was amongst the highest level Chinese Wushu masters of his age, and that made him equivalent to the highest level in Western boxing, judo and jiu-jitsu, for example. And it's very easy from there just to fall into the trap of thinking that judo, boxing, jiu-jitsu also have this kind of fixed higher level, and that if Wang Xiangzhai was equivalent to that back in his day, then he would also be equivalent to the highest level in this day. And that's not true, because judo, jiu-jitsu, Western boxing have all significantly advanced generation upon generation. Higher level is not a fixed thing in those systems, and it's not a fixed thing in Chinese Wushu. That's just a fantasy that people hold on to in a world that makes people feel alienated and disenfranchised. If you can't let go of that expectation, which I absolutely understand, because to disappoint that expectation when it's become a fundamental feature of how you are holding onto your grip on sanity is a terrible thing to ask of people. So the only thing that I do ask is, don't continue on this journey listening to me. But for those that do, the real truth is just so much more interesting. It's so much more profound. And it's just so much more fulfilling, ultimately, to live a life based around pursuing an understanding of the truth than it is to dwell within a lie. But it's also a lot easier to dwell within the lie. A lot easier. In any case, this is the ratio problem. Wang Xiangzhai sees the world of Chinese martial arts. He sees a tiny number of people achieve it, and it's not even an even distribution. So it's not like some people are okay, some people are rubbish. It's not this, if you've ever seen in statistics a bell curve where the vast majority of people are kind of in the middle section, they're average, and then you've got a tail on either side where some people are appalling, and on the other side some people are absolute geniuses. It's not even like that. That's what in statistics we would call a normal distribution. So it's not a normal distribution. From Wang Xiangzhai's perspective, there are a tiny handful of people who've achieved the true essence in any generation, and then there's the rest. And the rest can't really even be said to practice Chinese Wushu. They're so far below that level, you can't even call what they do genuine Chinese Wushu. And we know that this is how Wang Xiangzhai saw it. It's less easy to see and understand the genius of Wang Xiangzhai's solution to this problem. And we know this because the wider Chinese martial arts community is very much caught in a totally different understanding of how to solve this problem. And that's because they see the problem in a completely different way. So if you see these people who are talking about the need to save Chinese martial arts, the need to save Kung Fu, being in defense of traditional Wushu and so on. Their idea is that Wushu needs to be more martial, that you need to include more fight-based training. And the argument always goes that Wushu is perilously on the verge of becoming obsolete because there isn't enough fight-based training. And where that leads to is a couple of poor roads. So one road is poring over videos of MMA fights, trying to find some particular technique that vaguely resembles something in a traditional Wushu form, and then saying, oh, well, look, Wushu works. The other road is to deliberately try and do some kind of Kung Fu style pose within an actual sparring match or something like that, to try and force it in there. You're going to deliberately do a horse dance after you've hit someone, or you're going to try and pull off a move from a form and then say, look, well, Kung Fu works. It's a logical implication of Wang Xiangzhai's argument that techniques are secondary, that this is a trivial way of perceiving and solving the problem. And we can understand this partly by looking at Sandar, and to some degree Wang Xiangzhai, I think, would be very happy with Sandar because it's raised the overall fight relevance of Chinese Wushu, and it's raised the overall average standard. But we know from things that Wang Xiangzhai did say, and also from things that his students have said, that Wang Xiangzhai would have also been disappointed in Sandar, particularly in terms of presenting itself as the highest level achievement in Chinese Wushu. And the simple reason for that is that it focuses on techniques above and beyond movement quality, rather than there being a dialectical interaction between those two. And if there's no focus on movement quality, then the quintessence principles of Wushu are only very vaguely present in Sandar. And we know for sure that this is what Wang Xiangzhai would have said, because he says exactly this about Western boxing, and Sandar is very much like Western boxing in this context. Okay, so we need to understand that solving the ratio problem was Wang Xiangzhai's task, and it's not the only task that needed to be solved in Yiquan. So another problem is how to keep a pace with things like Western boxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and so on, as they go through generation after generation of improvement. But that's a different question that we can look at a different time, something that Zhao Daoxin, Wang Xiangzhai's student, particularly takes on as the key question of his generation. For now, let's stick with Wang Xiangzhai and the problem that he's faced with. How do you solve the ratio problem? And the solution isn't just to boost the number of geniuses or the tiny number of people who achieve it. The solution is to try and understand how that happens and to generalize the process by which people come to achieve it. So to understand this, you can think about public education. The point of public education isn't to create geniuses. The point of public education is to raise the overall standard of education across a territory. And it's taken for granted that if you do that, then there will be more geniuses achieving higher level just by definition. So solving the ratio problem means recognizing that there's a tiny number of people who've achieved it, and the rest, really, you can't even talk about them as even knowing Wushu. And Wang Xiangzhai says that directly. So you have to build up that middle section. You somehow have to re-educate the entirety of the Wushu field so that you create something like a normal distribution. And there are enormous barriers to achieving this, and as Zhao Daoxin says, the most significant barrier is the orthodox and established Wushu world itself. He says directly, you want to know what the real problem is? It's the Shifus. The Shifus, and then all of the administrative system that surrounds them and keeps them in their position. But we don't need to consider that today. We only need to understand Wang Xiangzhai's solution so that we can start working on it ourselves. And Wang Xiangzhai says something really very interesting here, which is that Yiquan starts from the top and works its way down to the bottom. I'm afraid my level of insight is not high enough to understand quite what the second part of that means, but I do absolutely understand what the first part of that means. And again, this is quite a contradictory idea, but from Wang Xiangzhai's perspective, when people achieve a very high level, what they achieve is something very simple. It's incredibly simple once you get it, and it's almost impossible to get, or it seems like that until you do get it. And that's the quality of movement itself. It's not just about physical form, we know that. It's about timing and fight IQ, but it is also about power generation, the way your body is connected together, and the way it functions as an overall system. Something happens with some people at a certain point of training where they make that kind of abstract leap, or again, you have to get your head around something here that's difficult to perceive because it's only understandable once you perceive it bodily, once you begin to achieve it. And this is the idea that the whole body is intent, or you retrain your body to reconnect mind and body so that you understand that intent flows throughout your whole physical structure. And then through a process of cultivation, eventually you can begin to use your body in a much more efficient way. And in the past, some people had achieved that, most people hadn't. And the question is, well, how do we get more people achieving it? And the answer is, go directly to that itself and begin training that first, as opposed to how everyone else, for the most part, had been doing it in Chinese Wushu, which is to start with technical training, to start with stances, forms, and somehow work towards it and just accept that it's a part of the process, that only a tiny number of people will ever make it through to that higher level stage. So Wang's idea is simple. Just start at that higher level stage. Just start at the point of developing that special kind of connectivity, re-understanding of yourself, and reconnection of intent into the whole body, and working on the quality of movement that those higher level people have developed. And to do that, you don't wait for it to emerge after years of other kinds of training. You begin training it directly, and then once you've achieved that, you start thinking about technical training, fight training, and so on. So you completely reverse the process. And we know how that's done. You begin with standing, you build balanced whole body unified force, then you learn how to skew that force, what we call the movement between single and double weightedness. You practice slow movement and you build quality of movement step by step. You go directly to the thing that makes higher level people higher level. Part of the problem with that then is that people assume that that's all there is to it, but higher level people also have fighting ability. They also have fight IQ. So these two things always exist in dialectical interrelationship, but that's something we can come back to. For now, we understand the beginning of the method, and we understand why we do this and why Wang Xiangzhai thought that this could solve the ratio problem. By getting the average level of people up to a point where everyone's got the same kind of quality of movement that the higher level people have, well, the next step is simple. It's just about fight training, and just like everything else, that's just about how much you want it. In any case, the next step for us now is to start moving on to that practical training and begin developing whole-bodied unified force on a higher level than what we've looked at before.